Ladies and gentlemen, пані та панове, please welcome episode number 39 of our series of conversation and interviews with intellectuals in Ukraine and abroad for those out there who are keen to learn more, think deeper, and hear from the original sources. Вітайте 39-й випуск нашої серії розмов та інтерв'ю з інтелектуалами в Україні та за кордоном для тих, хто хоче дізнатися більше, думати глибше та чути із перших джерел. This is a project of PEN Ukraine whose team is continuing their work under the extremely difficult conditions of Russia's continuing war against Ukraine. Today they are attacking my native city, Lviv, but the whole territory of Ukraine is under intensive shelling as well. Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Khmelnytsk, Ivano-Frankivsk, Odessa, and not even mentioning the east and other. At least 6 regions has no electricity and water as a result of intensive shelling. I'm so grateful to the whole PEN-Ukraine team that they are still able, God knows how, to proceed with our work. Це проєкт PEN Україна, вся команда якого продовжує свою роботу в надзвичайно складних умовах триваючої війни Росії проти України. Сьогодні вони атакують також і моє рідне місто, Львів. Та вся територія України перебуває під інтенсивними обстрілами. Київ, Харків, Запоріжжя, Хмельницький, Івано-Франківськ, Одеса, не згадуючи навіть про Схід. Уже у 6 областях немає електрики і води внаслідок інтенсивних обстрілів. Я дуже вдячна усій команді українського ПЕН, що вони все ще здатні, невідомо якими зусиллями, продовжувати нашу роботу. The project is co-hosted by PEN International, which has continued to provide a platform for freedom of expression for those currently under the highest risk. The project is implemented with the support of the US Embassy in Ukraine and our traditional partners, PEN America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. We stream today's event to all partners' Facebook pages. Співорганізатором проєкту є Міжнародний ПЕН, який продовжує надавати платформу для свободи вираження поглядів тим, хто перебуває у групі найвищого ризику. Нагадаю, що проект втілюється за підтримки Посольства США в Україні і наших традиційних партнерів PEN Америка, Українського інституту Лондон, Україна Світ, Локальна історія, Український науково-дослідний інститут Гарвардського університету та Інститут Гаррімана при Колумбійському університеті. Ми транслюємо сьогоднішню подію на усі партнерські сторінки у Facebook. Захід відбуватиметься англійською мовою. And I will switch into English to introduce our today's guests. I'm so honored to. My name is Olha Mukha and I work for PEN International. I'm delighted to introduce Oksana Lutsyshyna, Ukrainian writer, translator, and poet. For her novel, Ivan and Feba, she was awarded Lviv City of Literature UNESCO Prize in 2020. And I'm proud to say I was among the founders. And then Taras Shevchenko National Award in Fiction 2020. Holds a PhD in comparative literature and teaches Eastern European literature and the Ukrainian language at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Lutsyshyna's research interests revolve around the issue of metropolitan modernity and Central and Eastern European identity in literature. In collaboration with Olena Jennings, Oksana is translating the work of Ukrainian authors into English. Among the ones those works are translated are Mariana Kianovska, Vasil Makhno, Katerina Kalitko, Bogdana Matiash, and Artem Chekh. Since the full-scale invasion started, Oksana works a lot as ambassador of Ukrainian culture in the US, organizes meetings with the Ukrainian literary figures and the University of Texas and for the university community and the Ukrainian diaspora in the region. And she speaks today. I'm so pleased to introduce you, Arundhati Roy, a world-known novelist, Indian writer and eco-feminist, an activist for social justice and economic inequity, and an opponent and neoliberal globalization. Obviously, we all know Arundhati for her novel The God of Small Things, which won the Booker Prize for Fiction in 1997 and became the best-selling book for non-expatriate Indian author, and also for Ministry of Utmost Happiness. I should say the Ukrainian translations designed very beautiful way. That's the worst thing about those dialogues online, because I would love to sign all those books from you both. She is the author of 2 screenplays and several collections of essays. And she writes predominantly in English, requiring the reader to deduce the meaning of a number of words in her native language, spoken in, if I pronounce it well, Ayaminem, Kerala, and Malayama. There is to have a lot in common to discuss, starting from feminism and finishing with a big issue of colonization and decolonization. And I hope we will hear about these topics a lot today. If I leave them alone, they would speak for a month, but sadly I'm here and giving you literally 45 minutes before I'll be back with my questions. So dear viewers, you can also leave your questions in comments, and welcome once more, and stage is yours, dear ladies. Arundhati, please.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And before I, start speaking to Oksana, I just want to thank you for this series of talks that you've been doing, because it's very difficult for us really to get to hear people, writers and activists and thinkers from the Ukraine speaking to us directly, because this world is always mediated, as we know. I think before we start, talking, I just like to ask Oksana to bring us up to date with what's happening in the Ukraine right now. It's almost a year, going to be a year since the war started, and people in this part of the world, I think a lot of the conversations I saw were between Ukrainian writers and Europeans or Americans. And this part of the world has a very different magnetic field, of how things are looked at from here, what are the government saying, what are the media saying, what are people allowed to hear and not allowed to hear. So I'd love you to just bring people up to date, both emotionally and, just in terms of how exactly the war is happening as we speak.
Of course, and I'm also very grateful to Ukrainian PEN and International PEN for organizing the event, and to Arundhati for coming to speak to us today. I actually was in Ukraine in December. I visited Lviv and Uzhhorod, which is where my parents live. And you're right when you're saying that everything is mediated. It's very hard to know what's going on until you've actually touched the context, not just through reading, or not just through conversation with friends. And the most important thing that I saw when I was there is that I did not see anything that would even vaguely resemble any defeatist kind of attitudes. And people talk about how difficult the situation is at the front, but everybody was super energized, and I didn't expect to see that. I didn't know what I expected to see. I was just going there to see what I could see. And yet the spirit is very strong, and there was literally everyone from people who publish or speak, and to people who you just meet in the city, like taxi drivers would be talking about how Ukraine is standing up to Russian aggression. So that's the most important piece to me, at least. Otherwise, what I also have seen is how people are much more interested in literature and culture and history. Suddenly everybody knows everything they have not heard about in school, because many generations studied Soviet history. So I wasn't really talking about the genuine dynamic between Russia and Ukraine. Suddenly, you can hear words like colonial from people who you would never expect to even hear that term from. All my friends listen to Timothy Snyder's lectures online. So there's a lot going on, and it's tragic, but Ukraine is standing strong, in my opinion. How does it look from the outside? Does it look very different?
Well, it's so interesting because I've been listening to, you know, these conversations, and sometimes when I hear Ukrainians who are in the Ukraine and or involved in the war and talking about colonialism, you know, Russian colonialism, and I sometimes, you know, have echoes of what I hear on the streets of Kashmir here, you know, and you know, in some ways things are so so different, even in terms of how the war is being perceived here, because one situation is, you know, the country of Ukraine being invaded by a former colonizer, let's say the Soviet Union. And the other is the fact that there are huge powers involved in this war. And India has taken a very, I mean, India has a very old association with Russia, you know, economic and otherwise. So when you look at it from here, I mean, and we have seen, you know, obviously we've seen the other end of it, of the US and Afghanistan or in Iraq, you know. And so when I look at, like, I've just been, you know, collecting newspaper clippings, very recent ones like these, you know, and also trying to think in a worried sort of way of, will this, you know, will the machine that is backing the Ukraine right now, NATO, will it hold together, you know? Because I mean, we've all seen how they withdrew from Afghanistan, you know, and what happened just suddenly, you know, and the other, and then you start looking for signs, you know, of what is the back chatter that's going on. And I was rather surprised because last month, a very big reporter from the New York Times arrived in India, and he came to see me. And he wasn't familiar with India at all, but he told me that he was here to write a piece on India's position on the war in Ukraine, you know. So I was kind of interested in why this particular reporter had come, because he's a great, he was, you know, pretty great, has written in the past in support of Modi, you know.
Yes.
In the howdy Modi Trump business.
Right. Yes. I know what you're talking about. Yes.
So I was kind of curious, what would this piece be? It turned out to be a piece that really was very supportive of India's position, which is a position where India cannot afford to go against Russia, because 90% of the weapons are from Russia. Right now, India is importing many times more crude oil than it used to, and then selling it, refining it and selling it to the West. So you know, there are so many business dealings going on, and you look at so I'm just interested to see where all this is going, you know, like what are these powers that right now are totally backing Ukraine, but we are so traumatized by how people are suddenly dumped, you know. So I just have a worry about that.
Well, that's very interesting to hear, because I live in the United States, and this means that the only perspective that's, you know, how to look at Ukraine would be from United States and some sort of a mythical West, which United States kind of embodies more or less. So. And it's again, it's kind of Eurocentric colonial thinking sometimes, that to kind of see this conflict just as a conflict of Russia and West, forgetting that that's not the only parts of the world, that we have other parts of the world that may have completely different view on the situation. And It's just like you say in your essays that India is not a country, it's a continent, basically. Like it's composed of also so many parts in its turn. And then as a political
of its own, you know.
Right. And then politically it has a completely different stand perhaps than the places that I'm used to thinking when I look at this, because again, because of my living in the West, in the United States, and looking at it somewhat kind of from the perspective either a Ukrainian or someone who lives in the West.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, you know, and then there are other complications. I actually, just before COVID, I was actually in Lviv, you know, and
Right.
it was such a wonderful experience to me. Like my work was translated, my publishers, my translators. It was, you know, like I never imagined in my life, you know, as people who grow up in, you know, in places like India, initially, anyway, people of my generation, you know, you never think that you're going to travel to these places and so on.
Right.
So I grew up in Kerala, where we had, as is, you know, narrated in The God of Small Things, a communist, the first sort of democratically elected Marxist government in the world.
Right, right.
You have, you know, we also grew up with different kinds of propaganda. For example, we grew up obviously hearing about the Vietnam War and supporting the Vietnamese in their war against the US, but you were never allowed to say anything about Stalin or about, you know, what happened under Stalinism. Anything that was said, oh, that's just propaganda. Oh, there were no camps. Oh, you don't understand. Or you're just part of some Western imperialist line. I mean, The God of Small Things, for a different set of reasons, initially the Communist Party was furious with it because I was talking about caste and how communists don't understand caste and so on. Then you had a situation where you had, you know, Bangladesh, which used to be East Pakistan, right. And the West Pakistan was literally committing genocide in Bangladesh. And the Indian intervention was, the Americans were trying to prevent it. They moved their 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal, you know. And so the thing is that where, you know, I was looking at one of the conversations where someone was talking about values and interests, and I was wondering, do states as entities actually have values at all? I don't know, you know, because everything is like in the mix. I mean, Modi, you know, in 2002, after the Gujarat massacre, was denied entry, where thousands of Muslims were slaughtered on the streets. He was denied entry into the United States. He was denied a visa. When he became prime minister, the Indian market is huge. So it doesn't matter. You can slaughter who you want, but you're very welcome, and we will hold rallies for you, you know? So it's, you know, to know on the ground what is being done to Ukraine and to Ukrainians, to know the history of your country, which has been through, I mean, smashed in 1932 in the famine, you know, has been through so much. And then you have these narratives being placed on top of it, and it's very hard to extract a moral order from it, other than to say that one stands with the Ukrainian resistance today, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I hear you about the propaganda, and that's true. That's we have been hard at work trying to dispel it for all this time, and even before the full-scale invasion, and even before the invasion into Donbass, into Donetsk and Luhansk region, and annexation of Crimea, because this has been kind of inseparable from just you know, exporting, say, Russian culture, right? Somehow it was ingrained in it what it has been doing to other cultures. And it was very hard to let the world see what's actually going on, how this empire, what this empire is all about, and how it stands and how its narrative stands. So it's like dismantling this master narrative is a huge task, because it's already written as history and as history of literature, for example. And nowadays, many people who even teach and study Russian literature admit to this. There was an interesting article by Lev Batman in the New Yorker, and some other ones as well. But then people ask us, for example, okay, so we are ready to read Ukrainian literature, give us Ukrainian literature, and you realize that a lot of it has not been translated. And some of it has been a mystery even to ourselves, because of the people who were, banned and killed. And you mentioned the famine. And yes, this was 1930s, this is when Stalin actually attacked Ukraine in all possible and impossible ways. And what is the most visible is that he kills people, but then he also decimated the intellectual circles. It was kind of a simultaneous attack on everything that was Ukrainian. Any kind of an Ukrainian Communist Party which was not on board with Stalin's Communist Party, and also attack on religion. So when I teach that period to my students and we read Anne Applebaum, and there's these accounts of people who survived or didn't survive, but their accounts are still there. What struck me, for example, was that the most shameful thing that people felt was the fact that you could not bury the dead properly. And to us, it's kind of became, in modern world, death became so institutionalized and marginalized from life, and there were so many massacres, and we are so desensitized to things now. We don't even think about it that way, because very few people are truly religious. We don't understand what that means, a certain adherence to a certain ritual, a certain set of taboos, certain space of sacred versus profane, and the world has become so profane. So, and I think it's this is the way to kind of explain to the world and to kind of dispel this propaganda. And I know that you basically, your whole life, you're writing about war, because that's what's been happening. I kind of know that we have to do our job and do what we do best, but what else can we do? How else can we as writers stand up?
When you were talking about just now, when you were talking about how people were not allowed to bury the dead in the ways they wish to, I just got goose flesh, because I was just reading a long piece by a Kashmiri journalist who's a friend of mine, just came out today, about it's just like pray quickly and leave, where basically Kashmiris who are killed, militants who are killed, their bodies are not given to their families, and they are, taken and buried in some distant place, and people are so distressed now. The families want to move to the remote places where the graves are, and though obviously in terms of populations and in terms of the power of the powers involved in this Kashmir moment. I mean, unlike Russia and the US and Europe, these are much smaller powers, India and Pakistan. But, the erasing of, let's say, the culture of a place like Kashmir is that project is on. Kashmiris, when whatever cultural product comes out of India, everything is hyper nationalistic, and Kashmir is the flogging post across the board, whether it's secular, whether it's Hindu nationalist, whoever it is. And Kashmiris call it the flyover project, like we don't exist, only your dialogue exists, And right now, the same thing is happening to many people in India, where you have a Hindu nationalist regime trying to say that this country, which has hundreds of religions, languages, subnationalities, ethnicities, just like the Soviet Union, now they're saying Hindustan, which means there should be one language, one religion, one country, and nothing has been learned from history. So I mean to have been, and India, for reasons of its geography, Indians have not suffered war in the way Europe, Russia, East Europe have, So there's a lot of posturing and a lot of pretense about this ultra macho nationalism. But I hear what you are saying, about the fact that this country, your country and your story is missing in the narrative, or also because of geopolitically where you're located. We know that even Nazi Germany coveted Ukrainian soil. That was the colony that they hoped to have. That was how the expanse took place. But when I first came to Lviv and went to Poland, I had actually never been to Eastern Europe before, and I had grown up in a space where I don't call myself a communist at all, but the left has has done good work in India, and one supports them for a whole variety of reasons. And then when I came there, I was so taken aback by the anger against the Soviets and Soviet communism, and one listened to it, and the fact that here, not as a matter of policy, but almost as a piece of old legacy which you just don't want to deal with. Communist parties continue to support Stalinism, and they continue to behave as if Putin is in some way a communist, or has some legacy of socialism or communism, and which is so ridiculous, because he has so much contempt for it anyway. But yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, in God of Small Things, I remember when you were talking about Kerala, that basically the Christian philosophy of life is closer to communist philosophy of life, and the communists also have this the kingdom of the kind of like a heavenly kingdom with a proletariat taking over. And so basically it's like it has this holy trinity, Marx, Engels, Lenin, and so on. So it kind of creates a sort of reductive picture of the world if it's brought into a country like India, where there's the religious diversity is so great, and there's so many mythologies and gods and so on and so forth. So I remember that was quite.
It's true, and yet Kerala, for example, if you go there now, I come from there and I just came back from there, you see that it's completely different from the rest of India, because the level of education, the level of economic prosperity, all of that, the level of intelligence and understanding is different from the rest of India, because all these things together, whether it was Islam or Hinduism or Christianity or Marxism, they swim together in that place, and they have done good, whereas in the rest of India, you have crazy stuff going on right now, where people are just if you look at my bookshelves right now, they're full of books about the Second World War, because one is struggling to understand how can a whole population be hypnotized by hatred, which is what is happening here now. Just the other day, somebody I was talking to about Ukraine, and they started saying, oh, but about the Azov regiment and all. I said, listen, if you're talking about Nazi marches, India should be bombed to hell, because we are witnessing tens of thousands of people with swords chanting for the death of Muslims, for the mass rape of Muslim women and all this. So how do you suddenly start making these value judgments on a country that's under attack,
Well, it's I just read an essay by Oksana Lutsyshyna, our leading writer and intellectual, where she says that it's in some ways it's impossible to understand what's happening if we just look at history, because here we need not so much a historian but a cultural anthropologist to look at the sort of mythological structures. And you might have this whole idea of Nazi and Ukrainian being Nazis. This is again this propaganda trick where Russia is capitalizing on the victory in World War II that was achieved. Well, some historians would say by Soviet Union, some with Soviet Union along, but anyway, but I heard a very reputable historian of Holocaust actually here at UT say that it was the Red Army that stopped Hitler. So I believe her. And yet it's kind of like...
Yeah, when you hear Putin today, I mean, he sounds more Nazi than anyone else, you know.
So yeah, so
what they're talking about. Yeah.
Right, but it's this idea of Nazis now is being projected onto Ukraine. Supposedly, Russia is still fighting the Nazis because this is it's a mythologema that people still react to. It's kind of like, you know, we grew up, even my generation grew up on films that portrayed World War II, and so anything that was German or Nazi, you know, that's the worst evil on the planet. So now they're just emptied that shell and put new content in it. Let's say Ukrainians are now Nazis and project that and tell that to the world, and maybe the world will believe. And I suppose some do, and that's the problem. Then you have to go and remind people that right-wing nationalism exists everywhere, and actually we have such a small amount of that compared to what some other countries have that it's even ridiculous to mention. But
that's what I'm saying, you know, that you need to, you know, before you start a war, you need to create an enemy where a whole country is depicted in a certain way. But tell me, how do you, since you're in the US, I want to ask you this. Do you see any chance of Trump coming back to power? And if he does, how will it affect things in the Ukraine?
Well, I am certainly hoping that not. I am afraid to even go there in terms of like thinking about it. But if God forbid something like that were to happen, I think it would have bad consequences for Ukraine because of Trump's ties to Putin. And actually every day there's a new scandal about another high-end official being somehow connected to the Russians and Russian power circle. I just posted something about that like a couple of weeks ago. So it looks like this kind of corruption reached a rather unprecedented scale. So yeah, I'm really hoping that that's not going to happen. And I know that somehow, I mean, it's my impression that it's some kind of, Trump embodies to me some sort of populism that is also deeply connected to these very right-wing, very nationalist movements in the worst sense of the word, but not, and that again proves to me that Ukraine is not doing that badly because he's not really looking for allies there. But it's kind of trying to align himself to those in power that basically spread this, that make this even more solidified. I know about his ties to the Indian circles. I think he visited India, didn't he? And that was this very...
India, and put his arms around Modi while on the day that Muslims were being slaughtered on the streets of my city, Delhi. But did you read Seymour Hersh's piece today?
I don't think so. No, not yet.
I mean, I know that these things have been spoken about, but basically it's a piece about which says that Biden and the CIA covertly blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, you know, just before the war started. And yeah, so you know, what I'm saying is that you know, even during the Second World War, while England and Germany were at war, businessmen were making money selling things that country needed to do the other. So I really worry. I mean, sometimes I watch Fox News and right-wing channels, and then, of course, late Kissinger, Jeffrey Sachs, these people who you need to watch carefully, have been speaking about, this is a war that can't be won. It needs to have a negotiated settlement. So I was just wondering if you wanted to speak about how you see that, and how does one look at how things are going to pan out, you look at Fox News and they are, they
Yeah, I
they,
know.
yeah. So, but these are people, this is all part of another ecosystem which needs to be, watched.
Right. And I've heard that. I hear that even from friends from other countries, like, so when are you going to negotiate? You will need to negotiate. This will have to happen because eventually everybody negotiates. And I don't think I'm ready to negotiate, and I don't think Ukraine is ready to negotiate. We will negotiate after victory, as we say. So, I wanted to quote Serhiy Zhadan here, a Ukrainian writer, who said that without victory, there is no justice. And I agree with that. So, and I know that this fight for justice can be a somewhat idealist idea, perhaps, and some would say unattainable, but I think that's what drives us now. So that's why we are not ready to consider any kind of, any negotiation or any sort of end to that. And so there is no peace also without justice, as Zhadan adds, and I agree with that too. So, and these conversations about peace are often masking this sort of like basically the same view at Ukraine that has been around for probably centuries. It's like, you're a smaller country, you just have to let go because you're not going to win. Russia is too big, too powerful. It's one of the world's superpowers, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that's something that's right now still on our agenda. So I don't know. I don't know what the good solution there will be eventually, but that's how things are right now, at least.
It's a very when in 2002, when the massacre took place of Muslims in Gujarat under Modi's chief ministership, I used to think that if you just tell people, you just describe it, how women were slaughtered, how pregnant women had the fetuses taken out, how people were burnt and chopped up and killed, and everybody would just get so shocked that they would politically something would happen to them. And in fact, as we have seen since then, the opposite has happened. People have rallied behind the murderers, basically. So one sees Kashmir now, there has been, it's not just, I think I spoke somewhere recently, I said, when you look at people in Kashmir, it's like, the Japanese has started growing square melons so that they could be stacked easily. It's like the Indian government is doing that to human beings at gunpoint, like there's no press, there's no Facebook. Nobody can say anything. And even here, most people in India don't want to say anything. And anyone who does say anything is going to be dragged in for sedition or put into jail or lynched on the streets or whatever it is that's going on. So it's so hard to, like you, we just keep saying that whatever it is, we're not going to be on your side, we'll go down, but we go down on this side. So, I hear what you're saying. Can you tell me I don't know if you know the answer to this. I mean, except I suppose in a general way, but how are sort of Ukrainian refugees doing in the various countries that they are in? Like, it's been a year now.
Yes.
How is it?
Yeah, well, that's a huge problem. That's a huge issue also, because here we see the issue of women's rights. It's like these women are thrown into just supporting their kids, basically. So they, whatever aspirations or career aspirations they have, they often have to put aside. At least that's what I see with my friends. So, that's really upsetting to see is in a general sense. So it really depends, but I know that lots of people are in Poland. I actually visited some of my friends when I was on my way to Ukraine, some writers who are there, and it's, you know, it's reasonably okay, but their husbands are in Ukraine. Many people have husbands on the front lines there, so they worry about that. Sometimes there are behavioral issues with kids. So these women basically dedicate themselves to that. They kind of have to sacrifice their, progress in other areas because they have to take care of their immediate family needs. And there's lots of, I mean, not so much in Poland, but I hear people in UK and Netherlands having this issue with dealing with, people there, because they are trying to explain what's going on and people don't necessarily understand what's going on. There's Russian propaganda still strong. Like, they want to help Ukraine, but they are not exactly sure what's going on, in that sense of they don't know how to, and they would sometimes try to introduce these Ukrainian women to some Russian people who are also running away from Putin. But there's a big controversy there because Ukrainians feel like their experience is very different from ours, and there's a strong reaction. But to the West, it doesn't seem that way. So they're like, oh, these are Russians and these are Ukrainians. Let's just all be friends. Can we just all be friends? And of course, that's just multiplies the trauma. So I don't know. I'm not sure if that's going to change anytime soon in any kind of positive dialogue right now. So yeah, I actually came to your talk in Lviv, the one that you mentioned, and I have read your books, and I admire your trajectory as a writer and the fact that you wrote so many essays also, and so I sometimes wonder what are the prospects of fiction in this regard? Like, what can we do? Can we do anything with fiction, or at the times like this we have to employ other forms of writing or other forms of I don't know, maybe public speaking or something, or is it too individual and we cannot even generalize that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty individual, you know. I mean, I think I'm somebody who somehow doesn't ever try to generalize or tell other writers what they should do or how they should do it and so on. Sometimes in my case, for example, when I wrote The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, it was a large part of it is about Kashmir, a place where you cannot tell the truth except in fiction,
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's really and right now, I mean, I kept trying to tell myself, don't talk about what's going on in India, because that's not the point of this conversation. But it's so traumatic for so many people. Like you said, I keep writing about war, but here peace is war. I mean, people being lynched on the streets, tens of thousands of Muslims having their homes bulldozed, all this under the banner of nationalism and who is an Indian and who isn't an Indian and who is a refugee and who isn't a refugee. We have this new citizenship law, which last was under the Nazis in Nuremberg, where people are being required to produce legacy papers to prove that they are citizens, people who don't have any papers at all. And, a country which is like India, full of slums, and, people have just lived, and suddenly you're like, if you're a Muslim, oh, you're in an unauthorized colony, we're going to bulldoze it down tomorrow, and tomorrow you're homeless, So how do you function in this time, except like through a series of traumas that creates texts which you're not sure what it's going to be, and then what the consequence of that is going to be? It's like I keep saying, if you're a Muslim in India, to be murdered is a crime because they'll file a case against your corpse,
Oh my God.
I'm not even being ironical,
I know.
So yeah, so writing, I think sometimes I just think writing is all you can do to stay sane. That's the only valuable motivation for me. And sometimes you just fall down the well and say, okay, it's all right if you're not sane, for a while at least, and then you climb back out. So it's these conversations about identity and about who has the right set of moral qualifications to be a real citizen, and even the people who are standing up against the regime, sometimes, like their only response is a different kind of violent nationalism, which I find hard to countenance, So you just keep thinking that, there are times when all you can do is to keep the tent pegs down and let the tidal wave wash over you and hope you'll still be there when it's gone.
Yeah, that's true. I for this last year, I haven't done any kind of writing that would qualify as fiction. It just wasn't somehow possible. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, it's a world of such complications, and I just feel like when I think about Ukraine, sometimes I feel like saying you must be as worried about your friends as you are of your enemies, because for us, I mean, the idea of Tony Blair, the last thing the Queen of England did was to give him the highest possible honor, when you read about people like Robert McNamara, who first started his career by bombing and killing 250,000 people in one night in Tokyo, then 3 million people in Vietnam, then you become the president of the World Bank, then you end your life by saying, how much evil must I do in order to do good? And people saying things like, these Asians, they don't value their lives, and therefore they put upon us the burden of committing genocide. And
that's just such a generalization. I can't even begin. It's kind of like the world forgets that how big Asia is and how diverse, and that there is no one Asian experience. That's again very Eurocentric or West-centric.
Just you just begin to understand how deep racism is. And then you come here to India and you see it being replicated within this culture in caste, caste is not race, but it's very similar. And we have just our own universe of bigotry and prejudice and violence.
Oh, yeah.
One's own universe of that, quite separate from what's going on elsewhere, and you look at the economic interests of all these big powers, and often you always, whether as an individual or as a community or as a professional, you're always wondering, who is positioning themselves to use you in what way,
Well, that comes to this question of values and how I think it's privilege that sometimes lets people have a certain kind of value. I'll give you an example. It's kind of abstract, but it makes a point. It's when I was reading God of Small Things with my American students, and to me, that's a novel about, prejudice, racial oppression, and so on. And I was stunned to understand suddenly that to them, it was a novel about a failed romance. And they didn't see the social context because they didn't have to. And
Oksana, you'll be surprised to hear that in Kerala, where the novel is set, where there was a criminal case against me for corrupting public morality and so on, there, among the elite, because they want to now claim the Booker Prize and all that, it's a novel about children, it's a novel about beautiful language. It's not a novel about prejudice.
How interesting.
It's exactly the same thing, so it's how can we take this book apart and just keep the parts that suit us,
But that's amazing, because that means that's great. Everybody, it's like a test. Everybody has their own vision of what the novel is about, depending on the context in which they live. So I find that
you have to. It's like what can and cannot be said by whom, So
right, and it also
the left in India can talk a lot about Palestine, but it'll keep very quiet about Kashmir. These things, you can talk a lot about US imperialism, but you keep quiet about Stalinism, Soviet Union, China, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the Gulag. None of that happened. So, then as an individual, how do you negotiate all this, And
from what you're saying, what's the most interesting to me here in this last part that you said is that what are the places of silences in each culture? It's like, what are people not talking about? And I think that's the part that's hardest to see from the outside, because like you said, everything is mediated, but it's also, you can at least tell somewhat what people talk about, but it's very hard to discern what people do not talk about in a particular culture.
Exactly. I mean, when the God of Small Things came out, and Booker Prize, and I was on the front page of all the magazines, and then India, the Hindu right-wing government came and did the nuclear tests, and I wrote this piece called The End of Imagination, which ended my romance with the middle class. But I said many times that, I realized then that keeping quiet was as political as speaking out. Everything is a process of editing, which is why I say everything's political, because what you don't want to address is as political as what you do want to address.
Yes, I hope, that's true. I remember actually reading War Talk when War Talk came out in the United States. That was right before the second election of Bush Jr. and Iraq War, and I know there were some friends in the United States who bought your book as present to their very conservative parents, and the parents were not pleased. They were like, "You cannot talk like this woman talks." And I was like, well, this guy lives in America and he has all the power in the world in terms of, citizenship in America and seemingly all this freedom, and he's afraid of a book written somewhere else on another continent. I thought that was fascinating, and it was not the only person like that.
I was in Turkey, I think, and there was this People's Tribunal on the war on Iraq, and someone was reporting about someone who said, "I'll take a bunker buster to anyone who's on the side of Arundhati Roy." And I was like, this is what I meant about the disproportionate use of force. Why a bunker buster when a bullet would do? Okay. I think we have a monitor. The class monitor is here now.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation and for pointing out all those differences between values and interests and how much this war opened it up to the world. And a lot of important issues were touched today, how colonization was hiding Ukrainian soul. We sometimes even opening for ourselves, honestly. And there's such an important context of Kashmirs, which adds to understanding the colonial approach from the different aspects as well. For the most important problem you touched today, the nature and impact of propaganda and censorship, and open this difficult topic of Ukrainians being pictured as Nazis, what is used as a very big pattern by Russian propaganda as well. And about the current impossibility of dialogues between refugees from both sides, how complicated and painful it is, even if we would like to engage them to speak to each other. And that was impressive, this conversation about censorship in the US, but I have important questions from Maluranghang to Arundhati Roy. As an Indian who has lived in Ukraine while a student for 5 years, I'm myself actively filling the gaps in my own ignorance of Ukraine as a colonized nation in the past few years. I'm appalled by the antagonism or ignorance, if I want to be kind, against Ukraine's causes, even by people of nations colonized by the West. What do you think is the responsibility of people in Asia, Africa, or Latin America to educate ourselves about Russian colonialism and imperialism? How do we go about telling stories despite governments and media and even some leftist activists spreading their own agenda?
Well, I think there's, when you want to know things in today's world, there's a lot of ways of finding it, and there are even many Russian writers who are not the classic, writers, but poets like Anna Akhmatova, Osip Mandelstam, the people who've written about the Gulag, about what happened, Eleanor Ginsburg, all these are such fascinating writers, Chinese writers too, talking about living through the Cultural Revolution. All of that is available for people, But as you said, people can't know about Ukraine unless Ukrainian literature is translated. And I think that's a very important project, because it's like, if I bring it back to an Indian context, I often think India, it's supposed to be a democracy. It's increasingly losing. Every democratic institution is failing now, but still, it is, as I said, a federation of so many languages, cultures, subnationalities, and so much of it is unknown to people. Who knows Malayalam literature? Not much of it is translated, or who knows what's happening, except people, it's a very robust literature within itself there. But, Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, all of these have so many stories to tell. Similarly, I think nobody can know about Ukraine until Ukrainians speak, until Ukrainian literature is translated, until it reaches out and touches people. I was so touched by the fact that my work is translated into Ukrainian. And I thought that is so beautiful, because here there's so much arrogance, I don't think much of Ukrainian or any other language is translated here, not even our own languages, But,
yeah, I know what you mean. I'm managing the Ukrainian stand on a London book fair following months, and we had literally yesterday conversation with the director of LBF, and I told, I want British publishers to open up Ukrainian literature beside the war. It's such a rich thing. And this is a thing for war not to overshadow the culture itself.
That is exactly the point, because the problem is that just when Afghanistan was under occupation, everyone who wrote on Afghanistan was on the front page, every book was selling, and now it's off the news. So it's off the news. It's okay, let millions of people die of starvation, let the Taliban come back. It's over for the West. That story's over, dumped,
Right.
So That's why I'm saying you have to be more as worried about your friends as your enemies, because
it's kind of media fatigue
already
in the West.
off the front pages, and they have a very short attention span.
Right, they do.
Yeah, that's so true. And thank you for sharing this experience. And I have another question to Oksana. What would you recommend to represent as a, I don't know, top 5 from Ukrainian culture from American perspective? Those can be different things.
Well, I have sent the scans of the book by Ivan Bahryany. In Ukrainian, it's Tigrolove, which would be something like tiger catches, but it's translated, I think, as The Hunters and the Hunted, which is a story about a Ukrainian man running away from the gulags and joining a community of Ukrainians who live in the Siberian taiga and support themselves independently, and then crosses the border to Manchuria and out of there somewhere else. So it's the stories that my students enjoy greatly, because they say it's actually has a happy ending and it's heroic. And they say, like, whenever we read Ukrainian literature, we cry, but here we actually rejoice. So they said, do you have more stuff like that? And that's what I was saying to Arundhati. I wonder, I mean, I think we're still discovering ourselves, like what we have. So I would definitely recommend anything by Ivan Bahryany, who wrote in the 1940s, basically, and he was in the immigration. I would definitely recommend Oksana Zabushko's work. She's a Ukrainian writer, also a feminist writer, published several novels available in English. Again, I'm limited by what's available in English too, so there would be writers that I would like to recommend. Then talking about 19th century, I would very much recommend Lesa Ukrainka. It's actually fin de siècle. And one of her plays, Cassandra, was just translated by Nina Murray, a wonderful translator, and actually staged in London, of which Olha might know. So that's another great book that I would recommend. I would recommend Serhiy Zhadan. Serhiy Zhadan has also published quite widely and available in English. I would recommend Mariana Kianovska's poetry book, Baban Yar. It's about the Holocaust in Ukraine during World War II, which again is the theme of war and the topic that has not been discussed much in Ukrainian mainstream, at least. So that's a very short list, and I could, of course, go on for a very long time.
I know. The interesting thing that in one of our dialogues, I was pushing Orhan Pamuk to add Tigrolove or Hunting and Hunting to his university program as well. And this is a great adventure novel. Yeah, it is. And translation is good. So yeah, this is it. That probably this is a shared task for both sides to open Ukraine for Ukrainians and for the world. But if you would ask yourself, what can I do as an intellectual? Today, my answer will be very poetic. Excuse me for that. I want to quote Arundhati: to love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty in its layer, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple. To respect strength, not power. Above all, to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget. I believe this quote represents the lives of all the Ukrainians today.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
And this is what our dialogues are about, touching the reality and deeper sense of it. Thank you, our great speakers. That was pure pleasure and honor to host you today. And this all would not be possible without the support of our partners, the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, PEN America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. And the gratitude, of course, to PEN Ukraine, which continues to stand on the front lines in the name of freedom and truth. PEN International is proud to be a platform that supports freedom of expression. We hope those dialogues give you enough insights and material for deep thinking. Thank you again. Thank you for
Arundhati.
joining us at
Awesome.
6:30 a.m. and late
Yes.
time in India.
Pleasure.
Thank you. I
Yeah,
hope
that
our
was great
people
privilege.
sometime.
And
Okay.
our next episode will be held next Thursday, February 16, our traditional time, 6 p.m. Kyiv time and 4 p.m. London time. We'll be hosting Yulia Musakovska, Ukrainian poet and translator, member of PAN Ukraine, and Dave Eggers, an American writer, editor, and publisher, who wrote a lot of books you probably read and watched. Watch our dialogues, spread the word, and stand with Ukraine. This is our shared responsibility today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oksana. And
Thank you so much, Arundhati.
you, I hope somewhere in the world